How does living through war affect children?
It's a question that Fergal Keane, one of the BBC's most experienced foreign correspondents, has been wrestling with for almost 40 years as he's been reporting from some of the most violent conflicts around the world.
It's as pertinent as ever as we see the conflict unfold over Iran. Unicef says that more than 1,100 children have been killed or injured across the region. And Fergal's come to understand the impacts of trauma on young minds the hard way. He's experienced his own mental breakdowns and been diagnosed with PTSD.
And so we sat down with him to understand the lessons he's learned.
From the BBC, I'm Tristan Redman.
And I'm Asma Khalid. And welcome to The Global Story on YouTube.
Before we start today's episode, it contains some distressing details of children's experiences in war, so please take care while watching. Also, we spoke with Fergal before the situation in the Middle East seriously deteriorated, so Asma caught up with Fergal a second time to get his latest reflections, and you'll hear that in the second part of the episode. Fergal, you've written this quite gripping article and quite overwhelming article for the BBC about how living through conflicts affects children, both in the short term and later in life. Why did you decide to write that story right now?
I've been sort of covering the conflict in Gaza since the Hamas attack on October the 7th. And it became clear to me that all of the trauma that I had witnessed being inflicted on children in the previous more than 3 decades of reporting as a BBC war correspondent, I was seeing it again, day after day. And it kind of moved me to reflect on where we were now in terms of the kind of legislation that would try and protect children, the kind of care that should be available to them, and the consequences, principally the consequences of that kind of daily experience of trauma, where you had Hamas and the Israelis battling it out in a largely civilian environment, where you had children suffering because of Israeli blockades, which made drastic limits on food, which put severe limits on medical care, the destruction of so much of the healthcare system in Israeli attacks. The Israelis say that's because Hamas are hiding in hospitals. But whatever the consequence of these has been, to create an environment where children have lived from day to day, so many of them wondering if they were going to wake up the following day. Today, there are kids dying in wars. In Ukraine, there are kids dying of diseases in Gaza, and as I say, many other parts of the world. And they are people, mostly they're people who live beyond our concern in the West.
Fergal, what made you realize that there were these untold stories of children's stories in particular, that you wanted to tell, that you felt, you ought to tell these stories of children being traumatized by experiencing war?
I think that came from my own childhood. I grew up in, I suppose, what people would call a broken home. And that was a home that was disrupted by alcoholism, where I was traumatized by the presence of my father's alcoholism. And it was an environment where sudden disruption was always possible. Fear was constantly present. Tension was constantly present. And where I learned very early to be quiet, not to speak up. I was feeling ashamed because of how alcoholism was affecting my home. And it's a very common thing in the children of addicts or children who experience that kind of severe dysfunction in their home environment. And so I was conscious when I went into journalism of feeling a need, and later as my kind of social conscience developed, a responsibility to tell the stories of those who could not readily find access to media, who could not readily express themselves in a manner that...
And those were particularly children, you felt?
Yeah. In a manner that adults would stop and listen to. It's about listening to their stories and allowing them to be told, with a very important caveat. And that is, of course, that in the telling of the story, you don't re-traumatize the child. And so for nowadays, I will not interview a child without having carefully gone through the ground beforehand with their guardian, hopefully with a mental health practitioner. And when we finish the interview, we always now make sure there is someone there who is in a position to counsel the child and comfort them.
Fergal, in the mid-90s, you reported from Rwanda, in particular, this horrendous genocide where 800,000 people, including children, were massacred. And then around the same time, you had your own child. It'll be 30 years since you wrote a quite famous audio essay called Letter to Daniel about your own son.
My dear son, it is 6 o'clock in the morning on the island of Hong Kong. You are asleep, cradled in my left arm, and I am learning the art of one-handed typing. Your mother, more tired yet more happy than I have ever known her, is sound asleep in the room next door, and there is soft quiet in our apartment. Like many foreign correspondents I know, I've lived a life that on occasion has veered close to the edge. War zones, natural disasters, darkness in all its shapes and forms. In a world of insecurity and ambition and ego, it's easy to be drawn in, to take chances with our lives, to believe that what we do and what people say about us is reason enough to gamble with death. Now, looking at your sleeping face, inches away from me, listening to your occasional sigh and gurgle, I wonder how I could ever have thought glory and prizes and praise were sweeter than life. And it's also true that I am pained, perhaps haunted is a better word, by the memory, suddenly so vivid now, of each suffering child I have come across on my journeys. To tell you the truth, it's nearly too much to bear at this moment, to even think of children being hurt and abused and killed. And yet looking at you, the images come flooding back.
I wish I could claim the credit for having the idea, but it wasn't my idea. It was Tony Grant, a man called Tony Grant, who was the editor of From Our Own Correspondent, this wonderful programme on the BBC, which is heard all around the world. It's one of our oldest programmes. And it does a very simple thing. It says to the correspondent, write what you've experienced. Very unusually, sometimes, what you felt. You know, we don't express our feelings in the day-to-day news reporting. Quite rightly, that's not what we're there for. Tony Grant rang me and he said, look, you've had a kid. Would you write what it's like being a foreign correspondent, having a child in Hong Kong as I was living then? And I kind of hummed and hawed and I said, well, I'm not sure, is it really what I should be doing? And then he prevailed on me and I did write it. And I wrote it in one sitting with the kid sitting in one arm and typing with the other hand. And I was absolutely blown away by the beauty of this child. I was just overwhelmed at what he represented, at the possibility of new beginnings. And it brought up memories of the children that I had seen, so many of them, who didn't enjoy the protection that my child had in my arms, in a nice, comfortable apartment in Hong Kong, looking out at the dawn, knowing that his future was going to be one surrounded by love, surrounded by care and security. And so writing it got really, I was very, very emotionally moved, churned up in the process of writing it, because it brought together so many different strands of my experience as a war correspondent over the previous decades.
I'm just leaving Tanzania. Ahead of me, the border with Rwanda, the country where some of the worst crimes against humanity of this century have been committed.
Fergal, you wrote that letter to your son in the mid-1990s. And that's around the same time period that you were reporting on the Rwandan genocide. And that has been a huge focus of your reporting over the years. And while you were there in the region, you met a 13-year-old girl named Valentina, who had lost her entire family.
Back in Nyarabuye, the killers had finally finished their work. After 4 days, they left, believing they'd killed all of their 1,000 Tutsi neighbours. But at the end of this trail, next to the church, badly wounded but still breathing, Valentina lay hidden among the corpses. For days and nights she lay still, listening to every sound.
I stayed there for some time, over a month. When I tried to get up, I would fall down. I figured that if the killers came, I would pretend to be dead.
Her hand had been cut in half by militiamen, and it got so badly infected that it seemed that she would die, that she would not have any way, really, of surviving. Yet you went back, and in 1997, you found that she had indeed survived, and you interviewed her about what she had been through.
In Nyarabuye, Valentina and the other orphans knew nothing of what was happening in the world beyond. For more than a month, they lived and slept among the rotting corpses.
At night, the dogs came. The dogs were coming and eating dead children outside and in the other rooms next to me. Then after some time, one dog came to where I was and started to eat a body. When this happened, I picked up a stone and threw it at the dog, and he got scared and ran away.
So when I first saw Valentina, it was during the genocide, and she was with a handful of other survivors in an abandoned government building, and there were some nurses from the rebel Rwandan Patriotic Front who were trying to help her, but they had no medicine. Yeah. Her hand was gangrenous, and she also had a big gash in her head from where she'd been macheted. But she did survive. You know, I went back 3 years later, and Valentina was alive, and she was living with her aunt, who had also survived the genocide.
Did that trauma stay with her over the years? I mean, I can't imagine it didn't affect her in some ways over the years.
Yeah, it does. I mean, you know, the expression that I absolutely hate is closure. You don't get closure on an experience like that. And if you witness massacre, if you see your family being butchered, you don't close a door and suddenly it's gone. She had a dream. Yeah, she had a dream where her mother came back to her in the dream, you know, and she dreamed of that, of a moment of being reunited with her mother. Of course, that was never going to happen. But, you know, a couple of years after that, Valentina was back in school. She came to London. She met my own kid at my house.
When was that, Fergal?
That would have been, I guess, maybe 1999, thereabouts.
Okay, so you stayed in touch with her over years?
Yeah, I did, yeah. And she met my son, and she went to school, and then she emigrated to the States.
Oh, wow.
Where she now lives. But she's made a life, and she has kids of her own. Given a chance, the human spirit, and especially children, are phenomenally resilient. I don't believe that anybody is doomed by what happened to them in their childhood.
Fergal, you yourself were later diagnosed with PTSD.
If I'm frank with you, I think I had PTSD from a very early age as a consequence of the environment in which I grew up. And paradoxically, what that did was create in me a need to be in places where that sense of fear, that tension, was recreated. Because I was perfectly formed to operate in war zones. You know, I was hyper-vigilant from the very earliest age, obviously watching out, you know, am I under threat? Is there a danger to me here? And that makes you very skilled at navigating a place like Rwanda or the streets of Belfast in the middle of rioting. When I came out of Rwanda in 1994, nobody was talking about journalists and PTSD. We went and we got drunk and talked about it in the bar, and that was it. And I self-medicated with alcohol, and you know, ended up as a fully functioning alcoholic, because that is, you know, it's such a common coping mechanism that people use. Anything to take you away from the pain, anything to take you away from that void, which is full of nightmares and bad memories. And as I say, you know, I kept running, and I kept running into conflict zones until I had a pretty big breakdown in about 2008. Went into hospital and was formally diagnosed with CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, as a result of numerous wartime experiences. But you know what? I came out. And I was a good boy for a while. I didn't go to the war zones. And then I went back. I mean, that is the definition of insanity. And I went back again and again until I crashed, predictably crashed once more. And then I remember that breakdown. It was about 3 years ago now. And I remember sitting in a psychiatric hospital at 3 a.m, looking out on the dark and thinking, this is never going to get better. Really, really at the deepest low possible, and feeling shame because of what I'd brought on my family. Because it's not just, trauma, PTSD doesn't affect just one person. Addiction doesn't affect just one person. It affects all of those who love you, who live in fear about what is going to happen to you. And I was watching a TV program, as you do, in the dark hours of the night when you can't go to sleep. And there was an American psychiatrist on it, and he sat down. He was talking to a celebrity, and he said, number one, he said, life is full of pain, okay? Number two, it's full of uncertainty. And number three, that if you're going to have decent mental health, you've got to work at it every single day of your life. Every day. And that's the thing that I came away with. That I could have all the help in the world as a grown-up, but I absolutely had to take action myself. And what did that involve? Well, it involved continuing therapy, staying out of war zones, and it involved surrounding myself with as much love as I could possibly find. And this goes back to what we were talking about with kids. It's just as important for grown-ups, to be around people who love you and to give that love back.
I mean, there are so many wars and conflicts happening in the world right now, places where, children don't have the choice of whether they can be there or not. They are there. Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan. What is the scale of the crisis for children around the world right now, Fergal?
The most recent figure we have is from 2024, and that talks about 520 million children living in conflict zones.
I mean, that's a staggering number, right? 1 in 5, 20% of the world's children. And so that makes me wonder that over the years of you covering wars, covering conflicts, has the knowledge of how to deal with children in war zones improved? I know you've been talking to experts about how to help children who might be suffering from PTSD.
The knowledge base has absolutely changed. Remarkable work being done. So, for example, you have doctors who have worked with children who went through the Bosnian civil war and the genocide at Srebrenica. And again, they found that a key element was this question of a family stability, of a community stability being created for children once the conflict had ended. I mean, they disagree about a few things, but on this they're absolutely of one mind. And that is that you can't recover from war trauma if you're living with continuing trauma. But you also have research into children who are living with fears. And I mentioned a while ago the whole question of avoidance, people being terrified of confronting anything that reminded them of what had happened during the war. And so there's a new field of theory, relatively new field of theory, which encourages children to slowly and carefully try to confront, obviously not death and massacre again, but things like learning to sleep alone. Being able to be alone, not having to sleep with a parent, because that's what they did during the war, because they were so consistently terrified. Now, it sounds like a simple thing, but as anybody who's tried to put a child to sleep, who's had a nightmare, a child who hasn't been traumatized will know it's very, very difficult. You're trying to comfort them. But it's a kind of essential part of a child being able to mature, grow up, separate out ultimately from the family.
Fergal, we made an episode yesterday here on The Global Story about the deadly strike on an elementary school in southern Iran. As we said here at the outset, UNICEF has reported that more than 1,100 children across the region have been reported injured or killed since this war in Iran broke out just a couple of weeks ago. We look at Gaza, meanwhile, which we spoke about earlier. There is a ceasefire on the books, but it is difficult nonetheless to know how children and their families are going to rebuild their lives. How are you reflecting on all of this?
What struck me when I saw the news, along with everybody else, of the airstrikes on Tehran and other Iranian cities, was what's it like for the kids underneath that? Because we've established by now in this conversation that it's my preoccupation. And I can't speak to any children in Iran at the moment, but I have been able to speak to a young woman who said a phrase to me via an intermediary, which just has been going around in my head for the last few days. And she said, this war, she said, it has come into our homes, it has come into our families, it has come into our blood. And I don't know when we're going to be able to get rid of it. And she was talking about the fear that is constant. You know, this. I've just seen some footage which was sent out to us of the night sky and the sound of bombing and this really eerie sound of dogs barking when they hear the aircraft approaching. And you're thinking to yourself, what's it like to be an adult under it, but to be a child? And who hasn't... Yes, there were airstrikes, there were attacks on the nuclear installations in an earlier phase of this conflict between Israel, America and Iran. But this kind of bombing in cities is something the vast majority of Iranian children will have had no experience of. Mm-hmm. And I think it goes back to the entire thread of our conversation. When wars begin, no matter where they are, children are the ones who have least capacity, least ability to protect themselves. And they're the ones who, under international law, under all the conventions that armed forces are meant to operate by, are the ones who should be most protected. But that just doesn't happen. It never has. And you have to wonder if it ever will.
Well, Fergal, thank you for bringing your insights and all of your years of reporting to us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.